When we begin to unravel the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer, we're not greeted with gentle wisdom or softened truths. Instead, we're met with a brutal, almost surgical analysis of human behavior, especially when it comes to his views on women. In his infamous essay on women, Schopenhauer doesn't just express skepticism. He launches an unfiltered assault on female nature. He claimed that women, by default, speak in ways that conceal rather than reveal their true intentions. To him, what a woman says is never quite what she means. Her words, he argued, are often crafted not to share truth, but to influence outcomes, maintain control, or subtly shape the environment around her. To modern ears, this sounds harsh, misogynistic even, but to understand why Schopenhauer believed this, we have to step into his world. A world where reason was revered above emotion. A world where the value of a statement rested solely on its alignment with objective truth. In that cold logic-driven landscape, anything emotional, nuanced, or tactful was seen not as sophisticated, but as manipulative. And since Schopenhauer believed women were more emotionally driven than men, he concluded that they naturally veiled their intentions in layers of pleasant-sounding words. He saw this as deceit, but what if he was simply looking at something he couldn't understand? What if he was confusing emotional intelligence with deception? What if he was witnessing survival instincts, communication skills, and adaptive social behavior, and mistaking all of it for lies? Schopenhauer believed women were biologically wired to be disingenuous, to present a version of themselves that didn't match their internal world. He wrote that women were meant to deceive, that their nature was rooted in cunning because their power wasn't physical, it was psychological. And so, he argued, a woman's words were not tools for truth, but tools for influence. But here's the deeper truth. What Schopenhauer saw as manipulation may have simply been the art of indirect communication. When a woman tells you everything is fine, she may not mean it in the literal sense, but is she lying? Or is she signaling in a language that's shaped by centuries of emotional intelligence, safety concerns, and social nuance? To Schopenhauer, the world was black and white, truth or lie, logic or emotion. There was no room in between. But life, and especially human interaction, doesn't live in that binary. It lives in the in-between. And that's where most of our communication actually happens. So yes, Schopenhauer exposed something. But maybe it wasn't women he exposed. Maybe he exposed the limitations of his own perception. His unwillingness to understand a type of intelligence that didn't fit neatly into philosophical categories. His failure to see that language isn't always about declaring facts. It's about preserving relationships, navigating complexity, and sometimes protecting ourselves from a world that doesn't always make space for direct truth. Schopenhauer saw a battlefield. Women saw a chessboard, and that difference in perception, that misunderstanding of strategy as deceit, is where the whole problem begins. Because sometimes it's not that someone is lying. It's that they're speaking in a code we've never taken the time to learn. If we really want to go deeper into Schopenhauer's belief that women say one thing but mean another, we have to move beyond the narrow lens of philosophy and into the vast terrain of human psychology, because the truth is, this phenomenon, this gap between what is said and what is meant, is not exclusive to women. It's human, and yet there are layers to how and why women, in particular, tend to communicate indirectly or in emotionally nuanced ways. And those layers are where the real story begins. Let's start with a simple observation. human beings are not wired to tell the raw truth at all times. We're wired to survive, to be accepted, to avoid conflict, to maintain harmony, and to protect our emotional world. And nowhere is this more evident than in communication. Words, for most people, aren't just tools for conveying facts. They're shields, mirrors, weapons, or bridges, depending on the situation. So when someone says, "I'm fine," they might not be lying. They might be protecting. They might be testing. They might be managing a storm inside that words can't safely express. Now bring gender into this equation. Historically, women have had less social power, less physical dominance, and fewer direct tools for influence. So, over generations, they developed subtle, emotionally intelligent ways of communicating their needs, discomforts, and boundaries. They learned to navigate a world where being too direct could lead to being dismissed, attacked, or misunderstood. That's not manipulation, that's survival. Psychologically speaking, this kind of communication is known as high-context communication, where much of the message is conveyed through tone, timing, body language, and unspoken signals rather than direct words. It's the difference between "I said what I meant" and "you should understand what I meant." And women, often socialized to read emotional cues and manage interpersonal dynamics from a young age, tend to master this more fluid, intuitive way of expressing themselves. Schopenhauer, in his Black and White World view, saw this as deception, but from a psychological perspective, it's a sophisticated system. When a woman says, "Do whatever you want," but clearly means the opposite, she's not being irrational, she's expressing conflict, hurt, or hesitation in a form that feels safer than outright confrontation. It's indirect, yes, but it's also rich in meaning. Think about it. In real life, how often do we all avoid saying exactly what we mean because we're afraid of being too vulnerable, too aggressive, or too honest for the moment? We cushion our words. We disguise our needs. We dance around the edge of the truth, hoping someone who really sees us will understand without us having to expose ourselves completely. That's not unique to women, but women, due to centuries of cultural conditioning, have simply become more skilled at it. So maybe Schopenhauer wasn't entirely wrong to notice that women often say things that carry double meanings, but he was wrong to assume that this made them inherently deceptive. What he failed to grasp was that communication isn't only about clarity, it's also about complexity. It's about being heard, not just being literal. It's about understanding the emotional music behind the words, not just the lyrics. When we label that as dishonest, we miss the depth of human interaction. We reduce a powerful survival tool to a flaw. We confuse subtlety for subversion, and in doing so, we shut down the possibility of truly understanding the people closest to us. Because the most dangerous thing is not when someone means something else, it's when we're too blind to see what they're actually trying to say. To really understand why Schopenhauer believed women often say one thing but mean another, we have to zoom in on something that's far more subtle and far more powerful than philosophy tends to. Acknowledge the social mask, not the kind worn to deceive, but the kind worn to survive, the kind shaped by culture, upbringing, and centuries of learned behavior. You see, in almost every society around the world, women have been conditioned, either directly or indirectly, to prioritize one thing above all else: social harmony. This drive to keep the peace, to smooth over conflict, to avoid direct confrontation, it's not weakness. It's strategy. It's the result of being born into a world where directness can often backfire, where being too honest might be seen as rude, emotional, aggressive, or even dangerous. And so, over time, women have learned to become fluent in the language of emotional diplomacy. They cushion their truths, soften their words, and often speak in ways that feel safer, more palatable, more socially acceptable, even when what they're truly feeling might be anything but. When a woman says, "It's okay," it might not mean she's actually okay. It might mean she's trying to avoid escalation. It might mean she's still processing the hurt. It might mean she doesn't feel safe enough to explain what's really wrong. And yet, to someone like Schopenhauer, who saw communication as a tool strictly for transferring facts, this comes across as contradiction, as dishonesty, as an inherent flaw in female character. But is it? Or is it simply a sign that women have had to master a more delicate, layered way of speaking, because the world hasn't always allowed them to speak plainly? From childhood, girls are often rewarded for being polite, accommodating, and emotionally aware. They learn to listen between the lines, to feel the tension in a room, to intuit what's not being said. They become experts at emotional translation, not just for themselves, but for everyone around them. And part of that translation means saying things that preserve dignity, that avoid humiliation, that protect both themselves and others from unnecessary pain. It's not lying, it's emotional intelligence in motion. Now, Schopenhauer didn't see this nuance. He saw a contradiction. He saw a mask, and assumed there was manipulation behind it. But what he was really witnessing was a response to a world that doesn't always make space for female authenticity. A world where telling the truth, especially about one's feelings, can lead to being dismissed or attacked. So what happens? Women adapt, they say what's expected, they give the answer that keeps the peace, and underneath it all, they hope someone will care enough to look deeper. What Schopenhauer failed to recognize is that a lot of what women say isn't about hiding the truth, it's about protecting it, shielding it until it's safe to bring it to the surface. When someone is conditioned to believe that directness will cost them love, respect, or safety, they don't abandon the truth. They just learn to dress it differently. So yes, maybe they say one thing and mean something else, but not because they're being dishonest, because they've learned that the truth, in its rawest form, isn't always welcomed. And instead of fighting the world with blunt force, they've learned to navigate it with grace, tact, and subtle power. And if we're quick to judge that as manipulation, we'll never understand the strength it takes to remain soft in a world that punishes softness. Schopenhauer believed that rationality was the highest form of human expression. To him, emotions were distractions, distortions, tools that blurred truth and clouded judgment. So when he looked at women and saw emotion driving their communication, their decisions, their relationships, he dismissed it all as weakness or cunning. He believed that a woman's tendency to speak indirectly, to conceal her full truth, or to communicate through emotion rather than logic, was proof of inferiority. But what if what he saw as a flaw was actually a different kind of intelligence, one he didn't understand? There are two very different ways of navigating the world. One is through the cold clarity of logic. The other is through the warm complexity of emotion. Schopenhauer chose the first. Women, often by necessity, developed mastery in the second, not because they couldn't reason, but because emotional intelligence was often their greatest tool for influence, connection, and survival in a world where direct power was not always available to them. Emotional intelligence isn't about ignoring facts, it's about understanding context. It's about reading people, sensing moods, managing conflict, and expressing feelings in ways that don't explode relationships. When someone says, "I'm fine," even when they're not, it's not a failure of truth. It's an effort to protect peace, to avoid burdening someone else, or to delay vulnerability until it feels safe. That's not deception, that's timing, that's emotional calibration, that's wisdom. But Schopenhauer saw all this emotion-driven behavior as irrational as noise. He couldn't grasp that what appears illogical on the surface can be deeply intelligent underneath. He couldn't see that someone might express their truth not in black and white statements, but through tone, timing, implication, and emotional layering. What he labeled as dishonest was often just non-linear communication. He mistook softness for weakness and subtlety for deceit. Imagine living in a world where showing your true thoughts openly might lead to rejection, punishment, or ridicule. In that world, you'd learn to speak carefully. You'd learn to suggest rather than state. You'd learn to read the emotional climate before opening your heart. And in doing so, you'd develop a sensitivity, a fluency in the emotional world that no textbook logic could ever match. That's what Schopenhauer missed. He thought women were manipulating reality when, in truth, many were simply navigating it with grace. He thought emotional nuance was a mask for dishonesty, when it was really a mirror reflecting the world around them. And in refusing to see the power in that nuance, he revealed more about his own limitations than about the women he judged so harshly. The greatest irony is that emotional intelligence can often accomplish what logic alone never could. It can diffuse a fight, save a relationship, build trust, heal wounds. It allows people to feel seen, heard, and understood, not just through words, but through presence, through empathy, through emotional attunement. Schopenhauer thought the highest mind was the one that could separate itself from emotion. But real life doesn't work that way. People are messy, relationships are layered, truth is rarely clean cut, and sometimes what looks like contradiction is just complexity wearing a human face. So yes, a woman might say one thing and mean another, not because she's trying to mislead, but because she's trying to be understood in a world that too often punishes her for speaking plainly. Schopenhauer couldn't see the intelligence in that, but if we do, we'll realize something powerful, that emotion isn't the enemy of truth. Sometimes it's the only path to it. When Schopenhauer accused women of saying one thing but meaning another, he assumed it was evidence of inconsistency, even dishonesty. But what he never paused to consider was this. Maybe that double meaning wasn't a flaw. It was a feature, a strength, a subtle kind of genius that uses language not as a straight line, but as a dance, because in the real world, words don't just carry facts. They carry signals, emotions, power, and women, often out of necessity, have mastered the art of saying more than one thing at a time. Think about how language works in everyday life. Most of us don't speak like robots, firing off bullet, point truths with no filter. We shade our meaning, we wrap hard truths in soft tones, we joke when we're hurting, we understate what we really need. And often, we say something polite while hoping the person in front of us hears the deeper message. It's a human thing. But when it comes to women, this layered communication is especially profound and often misunderstood. In cultures all over the world, women have historically been expected to be agreeable, graceful, and accommodating. That expectation doesn't vanish when there's something hard to say, so instead of confronting directly, many women learn how to embed their truth beneath their tone. They express discomfort with a smile. They decline without saying no, they suggest without demanding. And yes, sometimes they say something that technically sounds fine, while hoping someone will read between the lines and recognize it's not. This ability to communicate in double layers isn't just emotional self-protection, it's a form of social intelligence. It allows a woman to navigate complex relationships, to keep doors open, to speak truth in ways that don't threaten others' egos. It's the reason she can say, "I'm not mad," while radiating energy that makes it clear something is off. She's not being dishonest, she's communicating in a language that requires emotional fluency to understand. In many ways, this skill mirrors the way people in high-stakes environments speak. Diplomats, negotiators, therapists, they all learn how to deliver messages that protect dignity while still getting the point across. They use nuance, subtlety, and silence. They say one thing and mean something deeper, and no one accuses them of manipulation. So why is it different when a woman does the same thing? Schopenhauer mistook this layered communication as a tactic for control. He saw it as camouflage, not clarity. But what he didn't realize is that double meaning can be a sign of emotional depth, not deception. It can be a sign that someone is trying to preserve both the truth and the relationship, because sometimes saying exactly what you mean can destroy something fragile. And wisdom knows when to be precise and when to be poetic. In fact, some of the most powerful communication in human history has come through indirect language. Metaphors, proverbs, art, none of these speak in plain terms, yet they hold more truth than 1,000 facts ever could. And women, especially those who have had to express themselves carefully, strategically, have become fluent in that kind of communication. So yes, maybe they mean something else when they speak. Maybe they let their tone say what their words don't. Maybe they speak in coded emotional language, but that doesn't make it false. It makes it richer, deeper, more alive. Because not all truths shout, some whisper, and only the emotionally literate can hear them. If we've learned anything by looking through the lens of Schopenhauer and comparing it to the real, nuanced ways women communicate, it's that his philosophy may have identified a pattern, but he misread the meaning behind it. Yes, women often say one thing and mean something else, but not because they're trying to deceive, because they've been navigating a world that doesn't always reward honesty when it comes wrapped in raw emotion. So instead, they've mastered a quieter kind of language, one that weaves truth into tone, into timing, into the spaces between words. Schopenhauer saw this and labeled it as manipulation, but the real manipulation is assuming that there's only one valid way to speak, to express, to be understood. He judged what he didn't understand, and then taught others to do the same. And for far too long, we've allowed that judgment to frame the way we interpret women's words. As if every pause is a trap, as if every polite answer is a hidden trick, as if softness is simply a disguise for strategy. But what if, instead of judging, we started listening, not just to the words being said, but to what lies beneath them? The energy, the history, the fear, the longing, because what women often say with their mouths is just one layer. The deeper message lives in their eyes, their gestures, their silence, and you can't learn that kind of listening from philosophy books. You learn it by caring enough to look closer. Schopenhauer's world was a world of binaries, true or false, right or wrong, honest or deceptive. But the real world isn't built like that. The real world is built in layers, in contradictions, in complexities that defy simple categories. And anyone who tries to reduce people, especially women, to one-dimensional definitions misses the entire point of what it means to be human. Women have developed a way of speaking that isn't just about communication, it's about emotional safety, relational balance, and survival. What looks like contradiction is often caution. What sounds like ambiguity is often compassion. And what seems like confusion might actually be the clearest signal of all. Please understand me without making me bleed for it. If someone says one thing and means another, our instinct shouldn't be to accuse them of lying. Our instinct should be to ask, what are they protecting? What are they afraid to say out loud? What has the world taught them about the cost of directness? Because behind every softened phrase, there's a story, a reason, a history that shaped the way that truth is delivered. Schopenhauer didn't have space in his thinking for that kind of empathy, but we do. And when we choose to embrace the complexity, when we stop demanding perfect clarity and start respecting emotional intelligence, we become better listeners, better partners, better humans. The goal is not to expose women, as Schopenhauer tried to do. The goal is to understand them, to meet them in the spaces between what's said and what's meant, to recognize that sometimes when someone says something that feels vague, they're trusting you to fill in the blanks with care, not criticism. Because in the end, it's not about catching someone in contradiction. It's about catching them in their truth, even if that truth doesn't always come wrapped in straight lines.